Hello and welcome to all who have joined in the series of Free Press Journal and Mentor My Board for Grow with Governance. I, Neha Shah, founder of Mentor My Board, along with Bharti Iyer, welcome you all to this exclusive series by Free Press Journal in association with Mentor My Board on Grow with Governance. Focus of this series is on the role of independent directors in business growth and sustainability. Mentor My Board is a platform to groom, nurture, and handhold promoters, independent directors, women directors, and board aspirants with a vision to create a community of 1 lakh trained pool of directors. And we have been providing a virtual platform to directors, mentors, and corporate. Free Press Journal is more than 9 decades old newspaper. Today, Free Press Journal has gone beyond just being a print medium as it has been strong digital presence with large online subscription for their e-paper. FPJ has been quite active in the webinar series since the lockdown. Even before the lockdown, FPJ was actively involved in policy level discussions. And the present initiative organized today is a part of Free Press Journal's ongoing strategy to create awareness on various policy level topics. Drasilia is the principal correspondent with of Free Press Journal. So we welcome you, Drasilia, yours too. And over to you, Bharti ma'am, to welcome Sutapa Banerjee for the session.
Sutapa Banerjee has over 30 years of professional experience and has spent 24 years in financial services industry across two large multinational banks, ANZ Grindlays and ABN AMRO, and also a boutique Indian investment bank, Ambit, where she built and headed several businesses. A well-recognized thought leader in the wealth management space, she has headed and successfully built from scratch the private wealth businesses at both ABN AMRO Bank and Ambit Capital. She was also voted one of the top 20 global rising stars of wealth management by the Institutional Investor Group in 2007, which is an honor which has been accorded to the only Indian and one of only two winners from Asia. Congratulations, Sutapa. As a CEO, she led Ambit Private Wealth to Best Private Bank in India in the 2013 Asia Money polls. In 2012, she was shortlisted in the 50 most powerful women by Fortune India. Great. Currently, she is on the boards of several companies: Zomato Limited, Godrej Properties, JSW Cement, Axis Capital, Manappuram Finance, Camlin Sciences, and Niogen Fintech. She served on the board of Oxfam India and was a nominee director for Women's World Banking for several years. As a visiting faculty with IIM Ahmedabad, she created and taught an elective on behavioral biases in decision making and its impact on corporate practices with a focus on gender, a first for any business school anywhere, highly innovative. Sutapa is also an adjunct faculty with IICA, the government think tank under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. In addition, she works as a decision coach for senior leaders. Sutapa is an Advanced Leadership Fellow 2015 at Harvard University, her area of work in which she teaches, consults, trains, writes, speaks, both internationally and in India, is on cognitive noise and biases in decision making and the use of behavioral insights. She is a gold medalist in economics from the XLRI School of Management in India and an economics graduate from Presidency College, Kolkata. A member of the CII National Committee on Women's Empowerment and the Indian Women Network, she has also served on the CII National Committee on Integrity and Transparency in Governance and on the advisory panel of the India Responsible Business Forum. Amazing profile. Thank you so much for being here, Sutapa. My real privilege to meet you and interview you on the series of Grow with Governance.
Very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jessica, we'll start with the usual one. So Jessica is eager, So let's get started with you and Sutapa, please.
Yes. Firstly, to start with, I would like to know your board journey and what was the time, you decided, okay, I want to be part of the board, or what was it a more accidental or it just your decision to be on a board?
Okay. So it's a bit of both. Let me just say that, I was a straight-jacketed banker for about 24 years, bulk of it across two multinational banks, as in the long introduction she took us through. Ambit was about 4 years. So after 24 years, I kind of had reached the stage where I wanted to do something different. And it was almost like at the peak of my career. So it actually raised a lot of questions. Why is she kind of now wanting to move out? And rightly or wrongly, I kind of believed at that point of time that I could do my job in my sleep, possibly wrongly. But I needed to do something different. I'm a high energy person, so I kind of took the call that I would move without really knowing what I wanted to get into. I had an interest in the development sector, but since I've been a banker all my life, and that's what the professional identity had been, it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do. And then came this offer for a fellowship at Harvard, which then took me into academia for about a year. So it was a 1-year fellowship. And if you remember, the women on corporate board legislation came, I think, in 2014. So in many ways, I was actually not a beneficiary, because end of 2014 to end of 2015 is when I was in the US studying at Harvard, doing my fellowship. And that was when it actually came in. But what happened was, just when I wanted to quit, while I was still on my notice period, Oxfam approached me. And that was actually my very first board. So I started with a nonprofit board, and remains one of my, I finished my tenure in, I think, 2019. But it remains one of the very interesting boards that I've been on. And almost around the same time, there was a large conglomerate who also invited me, and I think that was the time when names started getting compiled by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and there was a mentorship program. I wouldn't call it an accreditation program. The very first one, which was started, I think, at that point of time by Spencer Stuart and by Arun Duggal, because the legislation came and they kind of wanted to get women board ready. So I remember initially being a little miffed, because I thought, I've got 24 years of experience, and I joined a very reputed nonprofit board. And, you all, whether it's a man or a woman, you both start out as a novice when you first get into your first board. Why would a woman need mentorship? So, as all sort of professionally qualified women, you tend to take that as, why only women, I have a very different, dramatically different point of view now, which we will come in the course of the interview. But I took it more out of curiosity, and I thought, you can only gain, you can't lose. And it remains a network that we are still part of. There's a Women on Corporate Board network that, we're all part of. More newer women have been added. That's a WhatsApp group. Now, when we have options where we sit, this original group sits on several boards, we invite others to kind of come in. And in more ways than one, I think it was a valuable short stint, maybe I think 6 months or 8 months. I wasn't a beneficiary of getting any placements out of that. But that network was useful. So as I said, Oxfam happened, and then one of these large corporates called me for one of their boards. And, the way all of this moves is, you show value, or you're found to be valuable in one board. Within that same group, I was put into another. And then, your name kind of spreads, people start to know you, and that's how the network kind of grows. So, that in a nutshell is how the journey began, which was way back in end of 2013, early 2014. When I quit my full-time role, I was very clear. I had tons of energy. I wanted to do different things. I wanted to explore. People say, to find your true calling and all of that. But essentially, I had a lot of curiosity about things. What I did not want to do was to stay on the corporate treadmill and just move up the line. I knew that is what I didn't want to do. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, right? So it was almost like a butterfly sniffing, because, you immediately at that time get offers from others, including also from, the impact space, which interested me, because that was in the development sector, kind of the cross between, it's not a non-profit, so it has to show profits, but it's also a social enterprise. And those kind of options came. But I didn't want to take on a job. I was happy to take on advisory roles, because I wanted to look at it, from the outside, get a bird's eye view, as it were, and figure if I really wanted to single-mindedly, again, focus on any one thing, or do something which has maybe a thread connecting a bunch of different things.
Yeah, so coming back to your tagline, or what you mentioned was sort of a thought process. So, good decisions can lead to bad outcomes, bad decisions can lead to good outcomes, hence, and there's a question mark at the end of it. So, what made you think of this? And I would like some examples on bad decisions leading to good outcomes.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So I'm glad you asked me that question. I did a talk recently where I actually brought that up myself to explain something. So everything to do. So let me just give you a quick snippet on what behavioral insights is. So behavioral insights comes from a subject called behavioral economics, which is the intersection of psychology and economics, right? And it actually turns the traditional economics I learned as an undergrad on its head. Because that teaches you, or the entire discipline is built on the fact that human beings are rational. We are logically coherent in how we make decisions. What behavioral economics teaches you, now that has never been accepted in the field of psychology, but these disciplines have been so siloed that there was never an intersection, right? And it's very interesting how that intersection also happened. But once that intersection happened, it was very clear that human beings, all of us, don't make decisions rationally. We do make it sometimes, but most of the time we don't make it rationally. We are affected by external influences. We are affected by the filter of our own experience, by the biases we've developed over a period of time, by a lot of noise, your own mood that day, how things were at home that day, how your kid was that day, tons of things, right? Something that you see in front of you can distract you. All of this shape the decisions that you make, right? Now, if that is so, and that impairs our judgment when it comes to making key decisions, behavioral insights is about what can you do to not get your judgment impaired, particularly in an organizational setting, right? And that's, so that tagline which I use is, in a way, both my designation and my tagline is both to kind of give a sense, in short, of what I did, what I do now, and in a way, my credentials. So when I say that line, it actually means that I'm divorcing outcomes from decisions. Because the moment you have a good outcome, we think we made the right decision. We made a good decision, right? And the moment the outcome is bad, we think sometimes that we may have made a bad decision, or we think it's bad luck.
Okay.
Right? Now, the fact is, luck plays a role both ways, and it's a significant role that it plays. So for every successful company, for every successful person, if that person is not talking about luck and trying to take all of the credit themselves, it's a problem. And that's not true, because a sizable amount of our lives is impacted by what is outside our control and what is luck. The pandemic is just one brutal, dramatic example. But at an individual level, if you just think back, a lot of what has happened to us has been not by design, but by default, by accident, by being at the right place at the right time, by certain things connecting, whatever, personal lives, relationships, as well as professional life. So what here I'm trying to say is the decision process. If something has gone right, you need to still go back to your decisions, the decision process, how you made the decision, to figure, was it just that things happened, luck played a role and made the outcome great, or did we play a role? I'm just giving you a very simple example, and an exaggerated example to make the point. Suppose you're an oil company CEO, and for just external factors, the oil price goes up and your profit shoots up. What did you do, right? So that's what I'm talking about. So can you strip out externality? Only if you strip that out would you know whether it was a genuinely good decision that led to the good outcome, right? And what do we do as human beings? Evolutionarily, we are made to react in a way where the moment there's a great outcome, we don't go back to the decision process, because we think, what we did worked. It need not have. And that's the reason why in the world of behavioral insights, which is now mainstreamed internationally, unfortunately not yet in India, and that's my baby steps in trying to make this subject more mainstream, is evaluate and really examine the decision process. And there are many tools by which you do that, such that where is good decision making or good skill So you distinguish between skill and luck. And similarly, you could have made a great decision, but things just happen, like in the pandemic. Great startup suddenly got wiped out because nobody knew that you would have such a thing could happen, right? There is nothing wrong in the decision that you made. In another circumstance, it would have worked, right? So it is just sort of making the splitting outcome and the decision and looking at the process, looking at the drivers of success rather than success itself. So it's a little counterintuitive, but that's what, behavioral insights or one aspect of that subject tells you. If you look at, for instance, if you look at some of the really, really successful companies, so I actually run workshops on this, and people say this company came and disrupted this entity, right? Some of them, if you actually just look at it, I would have loved to give you example. Maybe I can pull out some and actually give you the data. Actually started not with the idea of disrupting it. It started with very different reasons. And it happened more serendipitously that it disrupted another business, right? Okay. So, and there are many, many examples of those, from the tech world to even if you look at Walmart and how it started. So it's IKEA. I mean, it just needed to do something where it needed to ship something in a truck. And I could give you the most accurate example because I use it in my workshops. And it just needed to fit it into a small space. And somebody just thought about, okay, let me just dismantle and try to put it together later. That's how it was born. Right? So it wasn't that we strategically thought. So, that's the whole thing, that we insufficiently account for luck. So it wasn't a bad decision. It was a good decision, but the decision was not to go out and disrupt something. The decision was a simple decision to just survive and get going. But you ended up doing something which became huge.
Part of this due diligence, when we ask a director to join the board, invite him, it is a fit and proper criteria. In all boards, in all regulators, whether it's SEBI or IRDA or RBI, it's a fit and proper criteria for a director. And like you said, you don't want to get that director slotted into that particular angle. So with your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so fit here, the way I'm interpreting and the way the regulators interpret it is completely different. So there, the idea of fit is that you don't have any charges against you, that, you are of sound mind, that you've not been sort of disqualified. So that's fit and proper. So it's fit and proper in a very traditional sense, right? When I'm talking fit, we have this whole thing, it's not just in the board, but even in senior management, we say, will this person fit into our culture? What does fit mean?
Again, conformity.
And if you're talking values, it can be tested. We don't test things. We think we are testing for values, but what we're testing is for liking. Can he play golf with me? Can we have dinner together? We don't think we are testing a person on that, but this is subliminally there all the time. Our first impressions are colored by the person. Can I get along with this person? And the get along comes from, do we think similarly? Right? And the moment and that's exactly the opposite of cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity means the ability to think differently. And that's one of the ways to destroy biases, cognitive biases, because I have, coming from the world that I come from, one set of ways of thinking. Bias means, ways of thinking. Somebody else coming from the non-profit world or the government or, some other geography has a very different perspective. And it is the intermingling of these perspectives coming together, against each other that makes the decision process way more robust.
Taking off from your previous discussion, what do you feel you as an independent director in a non-financial services board, how did you contribute? How did you conform? What you felt did not work out? Some, without naming names of the companies, but to give the viewers and our audience, what do you feel were the challenges, and what do you feel were the best outcomes which you brought to the companies where you were independent director, because of the fact that you moved from financial services to totally different boards?
So, so one of the things which I discovered was that, and the initial years, it was an eye opener, because I thought, okay, I would learn, and I was also thinking that what would I contribute. But at the end of the day, even if the industry is different, which means the context in which it operates is very different, and let's take a very different industry, right? Whatever. At the end of the day, there are still processes, systems, controls, checks and balances. That's one part, right? Even though the context differs, you need to do it. And one of the things, coming from a foreign bank, two foreign banks with about over 2 decades of experience, is you are very, very clear about what are called SOP, standard operating procedures. So one of the first things I noticed is, so you have a problem, you've had, and it could be anything. It could be an accident. It could be a project which has gone into both time and cost overruns. One of the first things you start to question, so where is the SOP? Why? It's not a question of, what you do in terms of damage control now, but where is the process and checks and controls that will prevent it happening in future? So my thought process was always that, and I thought was obvious, should be obvious to everybody. It wasn't, because those kind of processes and controls, in the manner in which in the banking sector was really fleshed out, was not that fleshed out in these industries. So that's one clear example. The other thing is on strategizing, right? Of course, you need to learn how the business works, and you need to have an interest and curiosity. You see me in many sessions, I keep using the word curiosity, because that's one of the biggest, if you look for mindsets in people, open-mindedness and curiosity, to me, in a leader, ranks way higher than any other attribute.
Totally endorse.
It's very important. So one of the, and I'm answering a question which you may have had later or not had, I don't know, is how do you encourage good governance? To me, one of the things is you have to bring in fresh blood. You can't have the same set of people, because they will continue to look at the same problems in the same way. Just like you need fresh blood in an organization, you sometimes take in people for that. Identical in a board. That whole thing, sometimes it's about coming in because of this women on board, and then a woman as an independent director, so there's fresh coming in. Then there is this retirement age which has been put in. But otherwise, you will see people who have been there on the boards continuing for years and years. So you don't question, because you've seen it done in a particular way. And when you question as the newcomer, everybody actually learns and says, oh, that's an interesting question. And then they have no qualms in actually seeing value in that, and then using your expertise in other boards. So nobody is maligned to start with. It's just that all of us have biases, and we think in a particular way. We see people in a particular way. So unless somebody different comes and shows different thinking, we don't know that it even exists.
ESG has gained significance. Like it's becoming a lot more mainstream now. So how do you think boards can play an important role in this, and what do you think is a challenge at this point of time to push this idea among managers and among companies?
So it's interesting to also analyze and understand why is it gaining importance, right? And there are a few factors which are happening. So one of the first things which we need to understand is a company doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It exists in an environment. And what makes up that environment? That environment is made up of customers, it's made up of employees, it's made up of the community in which it is there, it is made up of the government, it is made up of suppliers. So all of these together form what is called shareholders, right? So that's the bunch or the group or the set of groups which together constitute what is called stakeholders, right? And if you look at what tools you have to engender and push any change in any toolbox, you have education. So educate people to move in a particular way. So in ESG, let's talk about the environment. So we all know about climate change. So you educate people. We've been educating people for donkey's years. Not much has really changed, right? Then you have what we call legislation, right? So in, one of the ESG elements in the social element, or call it the governance element, because it plays into both, was this gender piece, which is why you have a woman on board, right? And there are many others. So legislation plays a role. There is also legislation now happening on a variety of the environment issues as well. Then you have incentives, right? You can give subsidies, you can tax in a way that pushes the company in a particular direction. And the last is what I call behavioral insights or behavioral nudges. You use not money, but you do things which will push companies in a particular direction. Ranking of companies in certain areas. Other companies are ranked first, second, and third here. I am nowhere there. You will, if you are a company which is focused on that, move in that direction. You like to do what others do in your sector, in your space, right? So these are, to me, the four groups. So the four tools that you have in your toolbox. And these are the stakeholders. And if you look at it globally, different countries, different sectors are at different places in this whole spectrum. For instance, where consumer activism is very high, and particularly in the younger generation, if you are using child labor, I will stop buying this, right? So that's consumer pressure. So organizations are driven by pulls and pressures which come from the environment, right? So consumer activism is one. Shareholder activism, proxy advisors is the other, which you read about in the newspapers every day, even in the Indian context, right? That institutional shareholders are making their voice felt, right? And then you have the government, which is with legislation and independent directors, putting the onus on independent directors to say, you need to protect minority retail shareholders as well, not just institutional shareholders and not the promoter's interest. Now, all of these pulls and pressures work in tandem to nudge companies in a particular direction. And ESG, and I've kind of studied responsible investing when I was in Harvard. And one of the things which I actually see is that group, investment practices or investor pressure, is today quite significant. And it will become larger and larger. And it will be in the company's long-term interest to be ESG ready, because what they can then get is a lot of long-term funding from long-term investors, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, which control trillions of dollars, like pension funds, the Canadian pension funds, right? So these are very attractive investors to have. So then it becomes also in the company's interest to be able to, so then it becomes a must do. So ESG then becomes not a nice to do, but something I must do to be able to attract it, right? So that's the space in which organizations are. And at a board, what I think is very interesting is, see, what started in India initially was CSR, which is, the 2%, right? And I'm not a great votary of that, right? But one of the things it still did is you are mandated to have a CSR committee, right? What would be fantastic, and hence, you have the CEO's attention on it, it gets presented, we ask questions, and we make sure that at least the money is getting spent, at least certainly in the boards that I am, in the direction in which it ought to be spent, right? But that's only 2%. ESG subsumes, to me, CSR is a small part of what ESG is, because ESG is environment, social governance, and it has to be woven in across the entire value chain of the company, right? So the company needs to conduct itself responsibly and sustainably, right? So then it becomes a bigger thing. Now, even though it is not yet mandated by the government, there is no legislation that you have to have a ESG committee or a sustainability committee, companies have started to do it. I sit on 2 where they already have sustainability committees, even though it's not mandated, and it's a board committee. And the moment it's at the board, I actually honestly believe that it should be mandated, because the moment it comes to the board, it can never, even in not the nicer organizations where, the company is not driven in that direction, you can't then tick boxes. Because if you have a well-functioning board, the board members will ask questions. The independent directors are mandated to ask questions, right? So then it has to have the CEO's eyes on it. It's not just the compliance person or the sustainability officer's role. Because any legislation you put, see, to me, putting legislation is just one thing, right? How you make that legislation adoptable by companies is where the whole behavioral piece and incentives come together. So if it comes to the board level, chances of it being successful become higher, because it has top management, including the CEO and MD's eyes on it, because that person will be answering at the board, right? So the board, to me, plays a very critical role where ESG is concerned. And the second reason why the board plays a role is many of the board members, and I was in a couple of panels, a roundtable earlier, where many of us come from the commercial sector, sit on commercial boards, but are also sitting or have sat on non-profit boards. So there is a certain degree of, what should I say, intelligence, best practices from that sector that we also carry here, right? And I keep saying, that's the cross-fertilization, which is very interesting and important. And you can make this piece, then chances, you increase the probability of success for this at a board level.
Actually, I needed to take such a deep breath, Sutapa. So many fresh insights. You're such an interesting personality. And
Thank you so
lots
much.
of behavioral insights and amazing conversations.
It's a subject not too well known, I guess, so that this always happens, because
highly
it's not
intriguing.
a subject when I'm very passionate about the subject.
Yeah, I can see that. And that makes this so enlivening and interesting. Thank you for joining us.